"Security! We have a situation!" Jennifer Walsh's voice echoed through Goldman Sachs's marble lobby as Marcus Thompson stood calmly by the elevator. "Sir, you clearly don't belong here." The Hermes-clad clientele froze mid-conversation. Cell phones discreetly rose to record. Marcus, in faded jeans and worn sneakers, adjusted his backpack strap, the same backpack containing a boarding pass that would change everything in exactly 7 minutes. "This is private wealth management," Jennifer continued, her manicured finger pointing accusingly. "Community banking is 3 blocks down." Her voice dripped with the kind of condescension that turns touching stories into viral moments. The security guard's hand hovered over his radio, awaiting orders, but Marcus simply checked his watch. 2:47 p.m. He had 13 minutes before his scheduled meeting. What Jennifer didn't know would transform this moment from another routine discrimination incident into one of the most shocking black stories in corporate history, a real-life story that would reshape an entire industry. Have you ever held the power to destroy someone's career while they treated you like trash? The discrimination began with Jennifer Walsh's practiced scan, eyes moving deliberately from Marcus's scuffed sneakers to his faded Northwestern sweatshirt. Marcus recognized the look instantly. 23 years in corporate America had taught him to read these micro-expressions, the subtle tightening around the eyes that preceded professional humiliation. His grandmother used to call it the look that could steal your dignity if you let it. "I'm going to need multiple forms of identification and proof of liquid assets exceeding our minimum threshold," Jennifer announced, her voice carrying across the marble lobby like a courtroom verdict. Marcus almost smiled, remembering his first day as an intern at this very branch in 1999, when a different manager had used nearly identical words. Back then, he'd fumbled nervously through his wallet. Today, he simply observed the performance with clinical detachment. An elderly white gentleman in a $5,000 Brioni suit glided past the security checkpoint without breaking stride. Jennifer's face transformed instantly, the suspicious frown melting into a warm smile as she buzzed him through to the private elevator. No identification requested, no asset verification required. Marcus had witnessed this same theatrical double standard countless times during his investigation, but seeing it directed at himself felt like studying racism under a microscope. The Patek Philippe on his wrist read 2:49 p.m., 11 minutes until the emergency board meeting that would reshape this branch forever. Behind the reception desk, a young intern named Terrell activated his phone camera with practiced stealth. Marcus had read the kid's internal complaint last month. Brilliant finance major from Howard University, documenting discrimination patterns that perfectly aligned with the federal investigation's findings. The footage would become crucial evidence, though Terrell had no idea his recordings were already part of a larger legal strategy. "This is a private banking facility," Jennifer continued, each word dripping with territorial authority. "Perhaps you're looking for one of our retail locations?" The suggestion carried the weight of institutional racism that Marcus had spent decades navigating. His Harvard MBA thesis had explored exactly this phenomenon, how financial institutions used geography and aesthetics to maintain segregated service levels. Jennifer was providing a textbook example of discriminatory gatekeeping. As Marcus reached into his backpack, Jennifer caught a glimpse of cream-colored cardstock protruding from the front pocket. Not commercial airline stock, but the distinctive heavy paper of private aviation, tail numbers instead of flight codes. Her brain processed fragments: successful black professional, expensive timepiece, private jet access, Chicago address that should have triggered recognition protocols. But cognitive bias creates selective blindness, and Jennifer's assumptions overpowered obvious evidence. Marcus placed his Illinois driver's license on the marble counter, watching Jennifer examine it with theatrical suspicion. She began typing meaninglessly on a computer terminal that required no input for basic ID verification, a performance Marcus had witnessed from the other side during branch management training. "These days, we can't be too careful about fraud," she declared, though his credentials clearly warranted immediate VIP treatment according to the bank's own protocols. The phone calls began at 2:52 p.m. Board chair, emergency line, flashed on his screen. Marcus declined without hesitation, remembering his mentor's advice from years ago. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people reveal themselves completely before you reveal yourself. Jennifer noticed the call but interpreted it through her bias filter. Criminals often used fake caller IDs to appear legitimate. When CEO Office Direct called seconds later, she felt vindicated in her fraud theory. "Mr. Thompson," she said, drawing out his surname like evidence in a discrimination case, "I'll need documentation of your asset portfolio before we proceed. Bank statements, investment summaries, proof of income." Marcus recognized the tactic immediately, creating bureaucratic barriers that existed nowhere in Goldman Sachs policy. During his tenure designing customer service protocols, he'd specifically prohibited this kind of arbitrary documentation requirement for preliminary consultations. Derek, the security guard, shifted uncomfortably as the interaction stretched beyond normal parameters. His training manual covered standard scenarios. Legitimate customers processed quickly, problem individuals either departed or escalated to police intervention. This felt different. Marcus's unnatural calm suggested someone accustomed to power dynamics, not intimidated by authority. The marble lobby amplified every tension-filled sound, while other customers maintained their pretense of distraction. "I appreciate your thoroughness," Marcus replied, his tone carrying professional familiarity that made Derek unconsciously step backward. Fiduciary responsibility is crucial in wealth management. I'm sure your regional supervisor would be proud of your attention to detail. The comment landed with subtle menace. Marcus spoke about banking hierarchies with insider knowledge, discussing corporate structures like someone who understood them intimately. Jennifer's pride overrode her growing unease. She'd committed to this performance, and backing down would feel like admitting error. By 2:54 p.m., Terrell's live stream had reached 89,000 viewers, as people shared similar discrimination experiences in real-time comments. The digital audience was witnessing institutional racism unfold in Goldman Sachs's flagship location, creating viral documentation of systemic bias. Marcus reflected on the irony. He'd spent 6 months investigating discriminatory lending practices at this exact branch, analyzing complaint patterns that painted Jennifer Walsh as a repeat offender. The federal audit had uncovered $47 million in potentially biased loan rejections, but Jennifer remained oblivious to the investigation swirling around her. She was about to provide the final evidence needed for comprehensive reform. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to wait in the lobby while we complete our verification process," Jennifer announced with false authority. "This could take some time." Another phone buzz showed, "Goldman Sachs Board. Urgent." Marcus declined again, noting Jennifer's growing confidence in her fraud theory. She'd convinced herself that declining important calls proved criminal intent, rather than recognizing them as evidence of legitimate corporate authority. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying decades of boardroom experience, "I understand you're following what you believe to be protocol. But protocols in this industry can change very quickly, especially when they violate federal discrimination laws." Jennifer's face flushed, but retreat was impossible now. The performance had to continue until its inevitable conclusion. Marcus checked his watch. 2:55 p.m. 23 minutes of documented discrimination, 5 minutes until everything changed. The countdown had begun, and Jennifer Walsh was about to star in the most dramatic corporate reckoning in Goldman Sachs history. At 2:56 p.m., Regional Manager Tom Bradley emerged from the executive elevator with the urgency of someone whose quarterly performance review depended on crisis management. His $3,000 Armani suit couldn't disguise the panic Jennifer's frantic text had triggered. "Fraud situation escalating. Need immediate assistance." Marcus recognized the type instantly from his own corporate climbing days. Ambitious middle management, terrified of any situation that might reflect poorly on their leadership capabilities. "What's the situation?" Tom demanded, his voice carrying authority borrowed from hierarchy rather than earned through wisdom. Marcus had encountered dozens of Tom Bradleys during his 23 years navigating Wall Street. Men who confused positional power with actual competence, who solved problems through intimidation because investigation required skills they'd never developed. His own mentor at Morgan Stanley had warned him about this exact personality type. They're dangerous because they'd rather be decisively wrong than appear indecisive. Jennifer's relief was palpable as she gestured toward Marcus. Potential fraud case? Refusing documentation? Declining suspicious phone calls that appear to be fake caller IDs? Her confidence had rebuilt itself around Tom's presence, the way institutional bias gains strength through collective reinforcement. Marcus remembered reading about this psychological phenomenon during his Harvard Business School research, how individual prejudice multiplies when validated by authority figures. "Sir, I'm Tom Bradley, Regional Manager for Manhattan Private Banking," he announced, positioning himself between Marcus and the elevator bank like a territorial guardian. The body language was textbook corporate dominance, exactly the kind of posturing Marcus had learned to navigate during his own rise through Goldman Sachs hierarchy 15 years earlier. Back then, he'd been on the receiving end of similar treatment until his first major deal proved his worth to skeptical colleagues. Marcus remained perfectly still, his calm creating unsettling contrast to the escalating aggression. "No difficulty at all," he replied evenly. "I've provided valid identification that your staff is choosing to question." The emphasis on choosing carried weight that made Tom's jaw tighten. This wasn't the defensive response he'd expected from someone caught in fraudulent activity. During his investigation of this branch, Marcus had reviewed hours of security footage showing exactly this escalation pattern with other minority customers. Terrell's camera angle captured everything perfectly, his live stream exploding to 150,000 viewers as social media algorithms amplified the content. Marcus had read the intern's internal complaint last month. Brilliant Howard University finance major documenting discrimination patterns that aligned perfectly with the federal investigation's findings. The kid had no idea his recordings were already part of a larger legal strategy that would reshape industry standards. "I'm going to need you to empty your backpack contents for inspection," Tom declared, his voice echoing across marble designed to amplify authority. The request violated every Goldman Sachs protocol Marcus had helped establish during his policy development years. Private banking prospects weren't subjected to searches reserved for suspected criminals. But Tom was improvising theater designed to force voluntary departure through public humiliation. Marcus checked his Patek Philippe, 2:57 p.m. 3 minutes until the emergency board meeting he'd called specifically to address this branch's discrimination patterns. The irony was perfect. He'd flown in from Chicago to present evidence of systemic bias, and Tom Bradley was providing the final proof needed to accelerate federal intervention from years to weeks. His investigation had documented similar treatment affecting thousands of minority customers, but nothing compared to experiencing it personally. Derek positioned himself at Marcus's left shoulder while backup security materialized from the corridor. The physical intimidation followed a predictable script Marcus had witnessed countless times during his investigation. Surround the target, create public spectacle, force compliance through embarrassment. Tom's strategy relied on most people's natural conflict avoidance, but he was fundamentally misunderstanding his opponent's psychology and position. "I understand your security concerns," Marcus replied, his tone carrying undertones that made both guards unconsciously retreat. But forced searches without probable cause create significant legal liability for financial institutions. His casual reference to banking regulations wasn't lost on Tom, who recognized the vocabulary of someone familiar with corporate law from the inside. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Marcus spoke like an executive while maintaining complete immunity to authority-based intimidation. Tom's certainty began wavering as he processed the disconnect between Jennifer's fraud theory and Marcus's confident responses. During his own climb through Goldman Sachs hierarchy, he'd learned to read power dynamics instinctively, and everything about Marcus suggested someone accustomed to corporate authority rather than intimidated by it. But admitting error now would mean acknowledging participation in potential discrimination against a legitimate customer. At 2:58 p.m., Goldman Sachs board, conference line active, flashed on Marcus's screen. He declined while maintaining eye contact with Tom, whose confusion deepened with each refused connection. Marcus remembered his first board meeting 20 years ago, the nervous energy of trying to prove himself worthy of the room. Today felt different. He wasn't seeking validation, but delivering judgment on an institution that had failed its own standards. "You're disrupting other clients' banking experience," Tom announced, gesturing toward onlookers whose phones discreetly captured every moment. The accusation was precisely backwards. Disruption stemmed entirely from management's discriminatory treatment, not Marcus's presence. But shifting blame was a survival skill Tom had perfected during his 15-year climb through corporate hierarchy, the same skill set Marcus had once used before learning that real leadership required accepting responsibility. Terrell's footage had become a viral phenomenon, with viewers sharing across platforms faster than any marketing campaign could achieve. Comments evolved into real-time forums where people documented similar discrimination experiences, creating evidence of systemic banking bias that would soon reach federal investigators. Local news outlets were picking up the story as social media algorithms amplified content to millions of viewers. "I think we need to call the police," Jennifer whispered loudly enough for Marcus to hear. The threat was designed to force capitulation. Most people would rather leave than face potential arrest in public. But Marcus simply adjusted his backpack and checked his watch. 2:59 p.m. He'd spent months preparing for this exact moment, knowing that real change required undeniable documentation of institutional failure. Tom recognized the point of no return approaching. Either Marcus was an elaborate con artist deserving arrest, or they were committing catastrophic error that would destroy their careers. His experience suggested that backing down showed weakness, while instincts whispered warnings about Marcus's supernatural confidence in this situation. The regional manager had built his reputation on decisive action, but decisiveness without wisdom often leads to spectacular failure. "Sir, I'm giving you one final opportunity to leave voluntarily," Tom declared, his voice carrying across the lobby like judicial sentence. "Otherwise, we'll have you removed for trespassing on private property." The ultimatum was delivered with theatrical authority designed to end confrontation through intimidation rather than investigation. Exactly the kind of lazy leadership Marcus had learned to recognize and counter during his executive development. Marcus reached into his backpack slowly, deliberately, while every eye focused on his movements. Phones rose as customers prepared to document whatever emerged. Tom and Derek tensed, hands moving toward communication devices. Jennifer stepped backward, suddenly uncertain about pushing this confrontation to its logical conclusion. The atmosphere had shifted from routine discrimination to something approaching revelation. "I think," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying finality that made the marble lobby fall silent. "It's time I made that phone call." His tone suggested everything previous had been preliminary, data gathering about to transition into judgment. At exactly 3:00 p.m., Marcus Thompson reached for his phone one final time, and the countdown to corporate reckoning reached 0. Marcus Thompson's finger hovered over his phone for exactly 3 seconds. The same pause his father had taught him before making life-changing decisions. "Count to 3, son. Let them show you who they really are before you show them who you are." The contact name was visible to anyone close enough. Board emergency line, direct access. Not fraud, but the emergency system only 12 people in Goldman Sachs's global hierarchy could access. "Yes, this is Marcus Thompson," he said, his voice cutting through marble silence with surgical precision. "I'm currently at the Madison Avenue flagship branch, and I need our emergency board session moved to 3:45. We have a significant personnel situation requiring immediate documentation." Each word detonated Jennifer and Tom's fraud theory like controlled demolition. 23 minutes of discrimination crumbling into corporate disaster. Jennifer's transformation was captured perfectly by Terrell's camera, confusion melting into horrified recognition as her brain finally processed information it had rejected. She'd seen Marcus Thompson hundreds of times in company communications, executive announcements, quarterly reports. But cognitive bias had built walls between the casually dressed black man and the corporate executive she'd never bothered to learn by sight. Her mind had compartmentalized diversity leadership as invisible, theoretical figures, rather than real people who might walk through her doors. Tom's hands shook as he typed Marcus Thompson Goldman Sachs into Google, each search result landing like physical blows. Thompson named Chief Operating Officer. COO leads 2.8B acquisition. Thompson announces diversity initiative. Marcus watched Tom's face cycle through disbelief, recognition, and dawning horror as reality reconstructed itself around their catastrophic error. 20 years ago, Marcus had worn that same expression when his first major client revealed their identity after he'd initially dismissed them, a lesson in assumption that shaped his entire leadership philosophy. Furthermore, Marcus continued into his phone, legal needs to review today's security footage from multiple angles. We're examining potential federal discrimination violations, requiring immediate remediation during our ongoing fair lending investigation. The irony was perfect. They'd discriminated against the executive investigating their discrimination. Marcus remembered his mentor's warning from Harvard Business School. Sometimes the universe provides poetic justice so perfect, it feels scripted. The lobby atmosphere had shifted from routine bias to corporate catastrophe. Wealthy customers realized they were documenting history, not just discrimination, but the moment a Fortune 500 executive experienced the very treatment his investigation was designed to address. Marcus had spent 6 months analyzing similar incidents across 47 branches, but experiencing it personally added emotional weight that no data could capture. Derek recognized Marcus first. His security training, including executive identification protocols he'd studied but never expected to use. The calm confidence that seemed suspicious now revealed itself as natural boardroom bearing. Marcus had developed that presence during brutal early years climbing Wall Street hierarchy, learning to project authority even when facing institutional hostility. Derek's hand moved from his radio like it had become radioactive. "Sir, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Derek whispered, his voice carrying defeat. The understatement bordered on comedy, but his attempt at damage control revealed corporate survival mathematics, how quickly staff loyalty shifts when hierarchy reveals itself. Marcus had witnessed this dynamic countless times during executive site visits, watching frontline employees recalculate their positions when real power entered the room. Marcus held up one finger while continuing his call, a gesture that would have seemed arrogant from a fraud suspect, but now carried legitimate executive authority. "Yes, full incident report for board review. Jennifer Walsh, branch manager, Tom Bradley, regional manager. Complete timeline with witness statements and social media impact analysis." He'd learned this documentation protocol during his first discrimination lawsuit 20 years ago. Create comprehensive records before emotions cool and memories fade. Tom's Google search had progressed to images. Marcus, at last year's shareholder meeting, shaking hands with CEO David Solomon. The same Marcus Thompson who'd stood 3 feet away while Tom threatened him with arrest. The regional manager's career flashed before his eyes as he processed the magnitude of his misjudgment. Marcus remembered feeling similar devastation when his own early career mistakes nearly cost him everything. The difference was learning from failure rather than repeating it. "Mr. Thompson," Tom's voice cracked, "I think there's been confusion." Each syllable fought against recognition that no corporate spin could minimize what had occurred. He'd publicly humiliated his company's COO while it was live-streamed to hundreds of thousands. Marcus had been in Tom's position once, making assumptions that revealed more about his own biases than the situations he was managing. Marcus ended his call and turned full attention to Tom, the dynamic shift palpable. No longer security versus suspect, but executive conducting performance review that would determine Tom's future. "Confusion suggests accident," Marcus replied evenly. What I witnessed was systematic discrimination based on racial profiling. The clinical tone came from years of corporate investigations, learning to separate emotion from evidence when building cases for institutional change. Jennifer backed against the marble counter, her professional self-image crumbling. 3 years managing this branch, pride in preventing fraud, but her screening process had revealed itself as bias filter, seeing suspicious behavior in legitimate customers based on appearance. Marcus had documented identical patterns across the banking industry. Well-intentioned professionals whose unconscious prejudices created systematic discrimination they refused to acknowledge. "I need to understand your protocols," Marcus continued with audit-like detachment. "When did valid identification become insufficient? When did preliminary consultations require asset documentation?" His questions weren't seeking information, but building legal records for federal investigators. During his own discrimination experiences, he'd learned that documentation was everything. Without proof, bias became he-said-she-said disputes that institutions always won. Terrell's live stream had exploded into mainstream news. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News were preparing segments about Goldman Sachs discrimination, reporters scrambling to understand how a COO could be humiliated at his own company's branch. Marcus had dreaded this kind of publicity during his investigation, preferring institutional change to personal attention, but sometimes justice required uncomfortable spotlights. "Those phone calls you dismissed as fake," Marcus said, checking his watch, "were from our board chairman and CEO. They were confirming my arrival for today's emergency session about discrimination patterns at this branch. You've provided the final evidence for federal intervention." The revelation was devastating. Their discrimination occurred during active investigation of discriminatory practices. Tom's mind raced through damage control scenarios, but every option led to professional disaster. Acknowledging error meant admitting discrimination against company leadership. Maintaining fraud theory required ignoring overwhelming evidence. Marcus had watched dozens of managers face similar reckonings during his investigation. The moment when institutional protection evaporated and personal accountability became unavoidable. "I had no idea who you were," Jennifer whispered, barely audible. The statement was simultaneously true and damning. True because she'd never learned minority executives' faces. Damning because it revealed assumptions underlying her customer service. Marcus had heard identical protests at 47 other branches. The "I didn't know" defense was standard among caught discriminators, as if ignorance absolved responsibility for actions. During his Harvard research on banking discrimination, Marcus had studied this exact psychological pattern, how bias creates selective blindness that allows prejudice to flourish in supposedly equal institutions. Jennifer's ignorance wasn't accidental but systematic, product of organizational culture making diversity leadership invisible to frontline staff who claimed commitment to equality while practicing exclusion. "Your lack of recognition isn't the issue," Marcus replied with devastating precision. "The issue is how you treated someone you didn't recognize. Your protocols for unknown customers revealed discriminatory assumptions violating federal law and company policy." His analysis cut through excuses to expose systematic bias they'd demonstrated. 23 years of corporate experience had taught him that real change required confronting uncomfortable truths directly. The marble lobby had become impromptu courtroom where institutional discrimination faced trial in real time. Customers, staff, security formed involuntary jury witnessing corporate bias exposed surgically. Marcus had transformed from victim to prosecutor, using position to demand accountability. Most discrimination targets never could. His grandmother's words echoed. "Sometimes you have to use your blessings to bless others who can't bless themselves." At 3:02 p.m., CEO David Solomon texted, "Watching live stream. Board meeting moved to 4 p.m. Legal standing by." The message confirmed executive leadership was monitoring in real time, treating this as corporate crisis requiring immediate intervention. Tom and Jennifer were no longer managing customer service, but performing for ultimate bosses who would determine their futures. "I believe," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying judicial finality that silenced the lobby. "It's time we discussed consequences of what occurred here today." The word consequences hung like sentence, promising ramifications extending far beyond Madison Avenue. Jennifer and Tom were about to discover that some discrimination targets possess power to ensure accountability, and some corporate reckonings broadcast live to the world. Marcus thought of his father's advice one more time. "Son, when you have power, use it to protect people who don't." Today, he would do exactly that. The 47th floor boardroom felt like a war tribunal at 3:45 p.m. Marcus had attended hundreds of meetings in this glass-walled sanctuary overlooking Manhattan, but entering as both investigator and victim created a psychological vertigo that even his Harvard MBA hadn't prepared him for. The same leather chair where he'd celebrated promotions would now witness him demanding justice for his own discrimination. CEO David Solomon materialized on the wall-mounted monitor from London, his expression carrying controlled fury Marcus recognized from their worst quarterly disasters. "I watched the entire live stream," Solomon began without preamble. 2.3 million views and climbing. Our brand reputation is hemorrhaging in real time." His voice carried the weight of someone calculating damage while planning institutional surgery. Marcus remembered Solomon's first day as CEO 5 years ago, when he'd personally promised that Goldman Sachs would lead Wall Street in diversity advancement, a promise now being tested by viral discrimination footage. Sarah Morgan entered with the purposeful stride of someone who'd been preparing for this exact crisis. As chief legal officer, she'd helped Marcus navigate his own discrimination lawsuit 20 years earlier when she was a junior attorney and he was a mid-level manager fighting for career survival. "The timing couldn't be worse," she said, spreading documents across mahogany that gleamed like a corporate altar. FDIC investigators were already scheduled to review this branch next week for pattern discrimination. Today's incident transforms their inquiry from routine audit to federal case study. Regional Vice President Michael Rodriguez sat across from Marcus, his face reflecting the panic of watching subordinates commit corporate suicide on camera. "I've reviewed security footage from every conceivable angle," he reported, his voice tight with controlled anxiety. What Jennifer and Tom did was textbook racial profiling, captured in high definition with multiple witness corroboration. Rodriguez had climbed Goldman Sachs' hierarchy alongside Marcus, and both men understood that corporate survival required swift amputation when federal violations occurred in public view. Marcus opened his father's old leather portfolio, the same one he'd carried since Harvard Business School, now containing documents that would reshape American banking. "The financial hemorrhaging has already begun," he said, his voice carrying 23 years of corporate battlefield experience. "Brand reputation damage from today alone is projected at $47 million in lost business, based on client response patterns from similar discrimination scandals." The numbers weren't theoretical. Marcus had lived through Wells Fargo's fake account disaster, watched Bank of America pay hundreds of millions for mortgage bias, seen how discrimination scandals destroyed shareholder value faster than market crashes. "Legal exposure extends far beyond today," Sarah continued, her presentation revealing systematic institutional failure Marcus's investigation had uncovered. "We've documented patterns suggesting widespread bias affecting thousands of minority customers over 18 months. Federal investigators are no longer coming to audit, they're coming to prosecute." Her words landed like depth charges in the silent boardroom, each syllable representing accountability most discrimination victims never achieve. Solomon's voice cut through the video connection with CEO-level decisiveness. "Stock price dropped 3.2% in after-hours trading. High-net-worth clients are calling relationship managers, threatening account closures unless we demonstrate systematic reform rather than crisis management." Marcus had predicted this market response during his investigation planning. Institutional investors increasingly viewed discrimination as fiduciary risk rather than social issue. Rodriguez pulled up real-time data, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through client communications. 47 major accounts have expressed concern in the past 2 hours. Private wealth management is bleeding prospects faster than our systems can track. And the mathematics of discrimination were becoming brutally clear. Bias wasn't just morally bankrupt, it was financially catastrophic when exposed to sunlight. Marcus leaned forward, channeling the calm authority he'd developed surviving decades of corporate warfare. I'm proposing complete institutional overhaul, not individual punishment. First, immediate termination of Jennifer Walsh and Tom Bradley with industry-wide hiring restrictions. His recommendation wasn't driven by revenge but institutional necessity. Keeping discriminatory managers sent messages that bias carried no meaningful consequences. Second, Marcus continued, referencing investigation notes that had consumed 6 months of his life, mandatory unconscious bias certification for every customer-facing employee, with quarterly renewals and performance evaluation integration. He'd studied successful culture transformations at companies that had survived discrimination scandals. Theoretical diversity training was worthless without practical skills for recognizing and countering personal prejudices. Sarah calculated legal implications while taking rapid notes. Third element addresses monitoring technology. Real-time AI analysis of customer interactions, scanning for discriminatory language patterns, service timing disparities, arbitrary documentation requirements. Marcus had researched this technology extensively during his investigation, knowing that human bias was too subtle and systematic for manual oversight to detect consistently. Implementation speed is critical, Solomon interjected from London, his CEO experience recognizing that delayed response would be interpreted as institutional indifference. Federal investigators evaluate our response timeline as evidence of cultural commitment versus damage control. His analysis reflected corporate leadership understanding that discrimination scandals required complete cultural surgery rather than individual band-aids. Marcus opened his portfolio's final section, revealing the proposal that would transform crisis into industry leadership. $5 million fund for financial literacy programs in underserved communities, administered through partnership with established civil rights organizations. The recommendation addressed systematic exclusion that created banking discrimination's foundation. Equal financial education would make bias economically unsustainable. Rodriguez immediately grasped the strategic brilliance. Community investment transforms narrative from corporate scandal to industry leadership in civil rights advancement. His marketing background recognized that proactive justice carried superior optics to reactive punishment, especially when federal investigators were evaluating institutional commitment versus corporate theater. Non-compliance documentation is essential, Sarah added, her legal experience anticipating resistance from managers who might oppose cultural change. Federal lawsuit capability, SEC investigation into systematic lending bias, congressional testimony requirements, personal executive liability under Civil Rights Act provisions. Her warnings weren't theoretical. Other financial institutions had faced identical consequences when discrimination became systematic rather than aberrational. Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 23 years ago, he'd sat in a similar boardroom as the victim of discrimination, watching executives debate his humanity like a budget line item. His own mentor, the legendary investment banker who'd first hired him despite institutional bias, had taught him a crucial lesson. When you achieve power, use it to protect people who don't have any. That's how institutional change actually happens. Timeline needs aggressive implementation to demonstrate commitment while remaining realistic enough to ensure success, Marcus said, checking his watch. 30 days for management transitions, 60 days for comprehensive training launch, 90 days for technology deployment. The schedule reflected lessons learned from other institutions that had survived discrimination scandals through decisive action rather than gradual reform. Solomon's voice carried final authority as the CEO decision-maker. Approved unanimously across all recommendations. Sarah, coordinate with federal investigators to demonstrate proactive compliance beyond legal minimums. Michael, prepare communications strategy, emphasizing systematic reform over individual punishment. Marcus, maintain oversight authority with quarterly board reporting requirements. His decisions reflected corporate leadership, understanding that discrimination scandals required institutional transformation rather than crisis management. The boardroom atmosphere shifted as participants processed the magnitude of what had occurred. Routine workplace discrimination had become catalyst for industry-wide reform, live-streamed to millions and documented with sufficient precision to create federal case studies. Marcus had transformed from victim to architect of systematic change, wielding corporate position to ensure accountability that most discrimination targets never achieve. "There's one final consideration," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying personal weight rather than corporate authority. "Today demonstrates why diversity in leadership matters practically, not symbolically. If I'd been a community banker without executive position, Jennifer and Tom's discrimination would have continued unchallenged indefinitely. Real institutional change requires people with power using that power to protect people without it." The meeting concluded with handshakes that felt like signing corporate surrender documents. Jennifer Walsh and Tom Bradley's careers were ending, while systematic discrimination faced institutional death sentence. Marcus gathered his father's portfolio, the leather case that had carried him through decades of corporate battles, now holding documents that would reshape American banking's approach to equality. Walking from the boardroom at 4:30 p.m., Marcus knew that today's discrimination had become tomorrow's justice, live-streamed globally and documented with corporate precision that made institutional denial impossible. His father's advice echoed, "Son, when you have power, use it right." Today, he finally had. Jennifer Walsh's hands shook as she signed the termination papers at 8:30 a.m. the next morning, in the same conference room where she'd once celebrated becoming branch manager. Marcus wasn't present. He'd learned from his own discrimination lawsuit 20 years earlier that victims witnessing their perpetrator's downfall felt hollow rather than satisfying. True justice came through systematic change, not individual revenge. "Your employment is terminated for cause effective immediately," announced HR Director Patricia Kim, with clinical precision Marcus remembered from his own corporate battles. The discrimination violated federal civil rights laws and exposed Goldman Sachs to regulatory sanctions. Jennifer's banking career was ending with industry-wide hiring restrictions that would follow her permanently. No major financial institution would hire someone with documented discrimination in their employment record. Tom Bradley faced identical consequences in an adjacent room, his 15-year climb through Goldman Sachs' hierarchy erased by 23 minutes of filmed bias. Marcus had specifically requested that both terminations occur simultaneously, remembering how institutional discrimination required collective accountability rather than individual scapegoating. The security footage had been devastating. Tom's aggressive escalation had transformed workplace prejudice into potential federal crime. Derek Martinez received different treatment, mandatory retraining and permanent probation rather than termination. His security training had included bias recognition protocols he'd followed correctly until management pressure overwhelmed his better judgment. Marcus had advocated for this measured response during the board meeting, remembering the mentors who'd chosen his rehabilitation over destruction when he'd made early career mistakes. Derek would become living proof that second chances could produce institutional change agents. The public apology aired at noon across all Goldman Sachs platforms, each word reviewed by federal investigators monitoring corporate response in real time. Marcus had insisted on unconditional acknowledgement rather than defensive explanations. His Harvard Business School research on corporate crisis management had shown that accepting responsibility accelerated recovery while deflection prolonged damage. Goldman Sachs acknowledges that discrimination occurred and apologizes unconditionally, the statement began, words that carried weight because they admitted fault without qualification. But Marcus knew from personal experience that apologies meant nothing without systematic prevention. The dignity in banking protocol he'd designed during sleepless nights following the incident launched 60 days later, transforming customer service across every Goldman Sachs branch nationwide. The policy eliminated arbitrary questioning about customer belonging. Staff could only intervene for specific criminal behavior, never based on appearance or financial assumptions. The monitoring technology represented Marcus's most ambitious reform, born from his father's engineering wisdom. Fix problems at the source, son, not after they cause damage. AI-powered analysis detected bias in real time, scanning every customer interaction for discriminatory language patterns, service timing disparities, and documentation requirements that varied by customer appearance. Monthly assessments identified staff showing prejudice patterns before they became Jennifer Walsh-level problems. The system prevented 12 potential discrimination incidents in its first month, reported Chief Technology Officer Amanda Morgan during quarterly board review. Staff received immediate retraining rather than customers filing complaints. Marcus smiled, remembering his own discrimination experience. How different his career might have been if someone had intervened before bias became lawsuit-worthy behavior. The training overhaul consumed 40 hours per employee, replacing theoretical diversity seminars with practical bias recognition Marcus had designed from his own painful experiences. He'd personally reviewed every module, creating scenarios that felt authentic rather than academic because they drew from real discrimination he'd witnessed during his investigation of 47 branches. Good intentions without practical skills produced Jennifer Walsh disasters, he'd insisted during policy development. Industry impact exceeded Marcus's projections within 6 months. 43 major financial institutions adopted similar discrimination monitoring, choosing proactive compliance over reactive crisis management. His mentor from Harvard Business School called to say the incident had become required case study, teaching future executives how systematic bias could be eliminated through institutional leadership rather than individual punishment. The mentorship program represented Marcus's most personal reform, banking internships for minority students funded through his own salary restructuring. These kids need to see themselves in corporate leadership before they can imagine financial services careers, he'd explained to the Wall Street Journal. The program drew from his own experience as the only black executive in many rooms, understanding how representation prevented the assumptions that had created his discrimination crisis. Success measured itself through data that would have impressed his Harvard statistics professors. Discrimination complaints dropped 78% within 6 months, while minority customer satisfaction increased 43%. More meaningfully, similar improvements rippled across the industry as other institutions faced public pressure to match Goldman Sachs's transformed standards rather than risk viral discrimination incidents. Marcus reflected on the transformation during his keynote at the Banking Equality Summit he'd established. We didn't just fire 2 discriminatory employees, we eliminated the institutional culture that made their discrimination possible. That's the difference between punishment and prevention, between individual accountability and systematic change. The reforms had transformed personal humiliation into industry evolution, proving that discrimination's most powerful enemy wasn't individual punishment, but institutional transformation, guided by people with power who remembered powerlessness intimately. His grandmother's words echoed, "Sometimes your worst day becomes someone else's best hope." Today had become exactly that. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson walked through the same Goldman Sachs lobby where his humiliation had been live-streamed to 2.3 million viewers. But the marble floors now reflected something extraordinary. An institution transformed by accountability. The young intern who had risked his job to film the discrimination, Terrell Washington, approached with the confidence of someone whose courage had helped rewrite corporate history. "Mr. Thompson," Terrell said, his voice carrying pride that reminded Marcus of his own early career breakthroughs, "0 discrimination incidents across all Manhattan branches this month." The monitoring system caught 12 potential problems before they became Jennifer Walsh situations. The transformation was working exactly as Marcus had designed, prevention through technology rather than punishment through lawsuits. Derek Martinez had evolved from complicit security guard to the training program's most effective instructor, his personal experience with bias escalation helping other staff recognize when individual prejudice became institutional discrimination. During his latest session, Derek had told trainees, "I learned what Mr. Thompson already knew. Good people can enable bad systems when they stop thinking and start assuming." His honesty about failure had become the foundation for systematic success. The ripple effects had exceeded Marcus's Harvard-trained imagination. The Banking Equality Summit he'd established drew global attendance as financial institutions competed to demonstrate bias elimination rather than risk viral discrimination disasters. European banks implemented similar monitoring systems. Asian institutions adopted bias training protocols, and regulatory agencies worldwide began treating discrimination as systemic risk rather than individual misconduct. Standing in this lobby, Marcus reflected on his grandmother's wisdom about transforming pain into purpose. The 23 minutes of filmed discrimination that had initially mortified him had become the catalyst protecting thousands of minority customers from similar experiences. His worst professional moment had evolved into his greatest contribution to corporate justice, proving that individual courage combined with institutional power could reshape entire industries. The letters that arrived weekly told the real story. Minority customers receiving respectful service at banks nationwide, people who would never know their dignity, had been protected by reforms sparked in this exact spot. These represented the kind of touching stories Marcus had hoped to create through his investigation, real-life stories where systematic change prevented individual suffering rather than simply documenting it after the fact. His mentorship program had grown beyond Goldman Sachs into a comprehensive pipeline, introducing minority students to financial services careers. Watching young faces light up during corporate site visits reminded him why representation mattered practically. When kids could envision themselves in boardrooms, institutional assumptions about who belonged began crumbling naturally. These Black stories were being rewritten from discrimination narratives into leadership possibilities. The transformation proved his father's engineering wisdom correct. Fix problems at their source, son. Instead of accepting discrimination as inevitable, Marcus had eliminated the systems that made bias profitable and safe for institutions. The lobby where he'd once been humiliated now stood as proof that individual experiences could become collective protection when courage met opportunity. As Marcus prepared to leave, he remembered his mentor's final advice. Your worst day can become someone else's best hope. Today's reforms ensured that future customers would never experience the discrimination he'd endured, their dignity protected by changes born from his willingness to transform personal pain into institutional healing. Have you experienced discrimination that could have been prevented by better systems? Share your story in the comments. Your voice could inspire the next wave of institutional change. If this story moved you, share it with others who need to see that individual courage can reshape corporate culture. Subscribe to hear more stories of people who refused to accept injustice and transformed entire industries instead. Your experience matters. Your voice can change everything.